Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's co-sponsored webinar by one, Corsec Security Inc., a guiding partner to companies trying to complete the Common Criteria process, and two, CCLab, the only accredited Common Criteria laboratory performing evaluations in the CEE region. My name is Jake Nelson, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Corsec. Today, we will address 5 of the top Common Criteria mistakes companies most frequently make during the evaluation process. I am joined today by 2 very experienced and knowledgeable individuals within the Common Criteria space, Mr. Matt Keller, Corsec Senior Program Manager, and Mr. Gabor Hornyak, Head of Laboratory Services for CCLab. Both bring extensive knowledge on Common Criteria, but from 2 very distinctive vantage points. Mr. Hornyak has over 15 years of experience in the evaluation process and will discuss lessons learned from the laboratory side of the process. Mr. Keller has been in the certification business for 19 years and can provide insights from the consultant's perspective. Before we get started, I want to remind the audience to please submit all questions in the chat bar and we will address them after our discussion. The technical conversation should be about 20 minutes, which will leave us some time at the end to answer those questions. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Corsec's Matt Keller.
Thanks a lot, Jake. So I think the right place for us to start for this discussion is to do a quick overview of Common Criteria. So those of you that are already familiar with this, let me rest you assured, we're only going to spend about a slide on this and then we'll move on to the common mistakes. So the thing I want to tell you about Common Criteria is that it is a language to specify security requirements and a methodology for testing them that is used internationally. And there's 3 core things I just mentioned in that summary, that it's for security requirements, that it's more of a language of specifying requirements, and that it's international. So first, this standard is for testing security functionality of products, not performance or other metrics. So it's going to focus on the functions your product provides, providing security for itself and for a network at large. Second, it's more of a language for specifying requirements. It's not a set standard where there are 10 things you need to do and the laboratories are just testing those 10 things. The language of Common Criteria allows you to specify things in lots of different ways, in some cases unique to your product, and then it provides a methodology for laboratories to test everything from small little smart cards to huge racks of data storage equipment that takes up multiple rooms of space. And then the third thing is it's an international standard. There are 2 core international agreements that you need to be aware of. There's the CCRA, the Common Criteria Recognition Agreement, which is 28 different countries agreeing to recognize certificates produced by the other 27 nations. Additionally, there's the SOGIS agreement, primarily focused in Europe, that has 14 different nations all agreeing to mutually recognize certificates issued by those countries. So there is some overlap between those 2 groups, but it is an internationally recognized standard. Now with the basics covered, let's turn our attention to the common mistakes that we have seen over the years. So I want you all to be able to learn from the experiences that we've had in the past. So the first mistake is improper planning and preparation. Evaluations take a significant amount of time and money, and that's why it requires a well thought out plan to ensure that the time and money is put to its best use. So we need to start with why a company is trying to achieve Common Criteria evaluation. And once you understand the real drivers behind why you're trying to achieve this, that will inform the decisions that we're going to make throughout this planning stage. And it's important to start with this plan, again, so we don't end up wasting time and money. So there's a couple core big decisions that we do need to make. We need to think about and look at what scheme or government entity would actually issue the certificate. Remember, with the CCRA, there's 17 or 28 different nations that can issue these certificates. We need to look at protection profiles. And protection profiles are a predefined set of functional requirements for a specific product type. So there may already be a list of functions that you should be tested against for a firewall or an operating system or a VPN. We want to look at what assurance level is the right level to target for your evaluation. What will address your customers' needs? We can vastly overshoot that demand, but we'll spend additional time and effort and money to get to that higher assurance level. So we need to make sure we're choosing the right assurance level for your target. And probably most important to your engineering team, we need to make sure that we pick the right product and the specific product version that should go through this evaluation. Because common criteria is a version-specific certification, a point in time, so it's going to specify the exact version that was tested through this program. And all of these decisions come with trade-offs. So there's trade-offs that impact the time and cost of the overall evaluation. And so we don't want to just rush in and make a bunch of assumptions on, oh, well, I'll use the government scheme that's closest to me, or I'll just use this level of assurance, or I'll just target this product, without really looking at the drivers and making sure that we have a plan that is going to address the real need, the real reason you're pursuing this. I'll also mention, just once we have that detailed plan, we also need to get buy-in from across the organization to make sure that we're addressing the needs of sales, of marketing, and also that the executives in the company are bought in on this. So while we're building that detailed plan, I also want to warn you about mistake number 2. And mistake number 2 is overcomplicating the evaluation. When we start to look at what's going to be evaluated, we need to identify the target of evaluation. We call that the TOE, target of evaluation. And I want to explain something that I call TOE magic, or target of evaluation magic. And that is, whatever is in the boundary receives the vast majority of the lab scrutiny, and what's out gets looked at very little. So we need to be careful in how we choose what's in that boundary. If we throw everything in the kitchen sink in there, we could be overcomplicating the evaluation, costing us additional time and money. So we also need to look at whatever's in that boundary. We need your engineering team and ultimately the resources that are working on the evaluation, probably your consultant and your evaluation lab, to be able to really understand what's in that target of evaluation. Which does mean when something's in the boundary, even a third-party library or old code that no one's looked at in a long time, we need to have a good understanding of that architecture. So your engineering team will need to have a good understanding of those components, even if it is legacy code that hasn't been touched in a long time because it implements the basic auditing functions or basic identification and authentication of users. And the third major piece of this here with overcomplicating is we want to be careful with what's in, because any component that's in the evaluation could be a source of a vulnerability. And vulnerabilities are going to really slow down the CC evaluation. So what we want to do is we want to make sure we're choosing carefully so that we're not throwing everything in, but we want to make sure that the product we're choosing will be something that can be well marketed and really address the needs of the people pushing for this common criteria evaluation. So as I said, we'll choose carefully with the boundary, and we'll make sure that we have a good plan to move forward. Now with that, I'd like to hand it over to Gabor for more information about common mistakes that we see.
Thank you very much, Matt. I think it is the magic of the 21st century that it is possible to hold this webinar together. The third most common mistake, according to my experience, is that during the evaluations, the participants do not have sufficient information about the process. If the evaluation is already started, please still follow the process closely. The developers need to participate actively towards the laboratory and the certification body as well. The possible problems during an evaluation process are called observations, since these always contain an objective evidence which was observed to be non-conformant and the requirement to which it does not conform to. Best, if you can get to a laboratory which informs you about the progress of the activities and the possible problems, if there are any, at least weekly. To illustrate this, imagine a train which is stopped. If the ticket collector comes and there is information why it has stopped, the situation instantly improves for you and the other passengers as well. If there are no information, the passengers in the stopped train become distressed. It is the same in an evaluation process as well. If the information is available, that oils the whole process. But let me mention that the data needs to flow not just from the laboratory to the developer, but backwards as well. Please indicate if you already see that more time is needed for a certain activity on your side than it is planned, since the laboratory counts on the plan as well. There are always plans about the evaluation and certification process, and the actual activities can be compared to these plans. I think that this is just as important as the observations themselves. If you don't understand what happens and why, ask questions. The people of the laboratory and the schemes are the same as any people. They can be talked with and talked to. It is important. The scheme people can be talked to as well. Don't be afraid of them. If there are observations, you can talk about them internally. That always helps. But if you don't understand them, just ask the laboratory. Maybe there has not been enough information you already know and the laboratory doesn't. If the evaluators cannot help, you can turn to others. It is always better to talk through the problems than to conceal them. Sometimes the evaluators cannot help because of the bias this would cause. You can handle the observations in two ways. By informing the laboratory about what was not known to them beforehand, thus changing the documentation, or by changing the methods, or the TOE itself if needed. Evaluators, however, cannot help in any ways which advises directly on how to develop the conforming solutions or correct the observed mistakes. In the case of the Italian scheme, other people from the laboratory can actually act as consultants, or you can find a proactive consultant, which can also help you in understanding how the observed problems can be corrected. And this brings me to my next slide about resources. According to my laboratory experience more than a decade, the fourth most common mistake about the evaluations is if the developers do not spare sufficient resources on the process. The optimistic attitude, which otherwise can be healthy, as everything is already good, it can be a mistake during the evaluation. There are efforts which are required either by the developer or by a good consultation partner. There is someone who needs to overview the process, someone who the laboratory can ask, someone who creates the necessary documentation, and if there are changes, someone needs to develop those too. In all evaluation processes, some errors are observed, and this is true not because the laboratory is aiming to uncover the errors, but I think this is statistically true. For 15 years in the profession, I haven't seen an evaluation process without an observation report, or indeed without changes in the product. The task of the laboratory is to decide whether the product is sufficiently secure, and during the process, the laboratory as a third party will overview the product, revealing insights which the developers themselves do not have. This is true either because they are too close to the process or because the laboratory has an overview of the profession, as it is likely that they already have reviewed similar products as well. This means that they have expertise about best practices. It is absolutely forbidden for them to share actual information about other products, but it is an important factor that by reviewing other products as well, laboratories have a notion about the best practices, and this expertise can be used during the shaping of the verdicts. If there are observations, it is likely that there will be changes in the products as well, as I already said. And if the evaluation process needs to be done in a defined time frame, a good reaction time is essential. If the developer is prepared and can spare the required means, an EL2 process can be done in 3 months. But at the other end of the scale, without timely decisions and actions, an EL2 process can take more than a year. This is my actual experience. And for that expertise in common criteria, whether from inside or from a consultation partner, also resources need to be expanded. And the expertise in question brings us to the last slide about mistakes, misconceptions about evaluations. If the theory is well defined, the evaluation is ongoing, there is still room for misinterpretation. The next most common mistake is the misconception that the evaluation is unnecessarily long and complicated process. Yes, it is a long and complicated process, but everything happens for a reason. And the evaluation process is a long and perilous journey, but every long journey takes one step at a time. It is best to remember this. If you concentrate at every step, which at that present moment is the only one, the goal can be reached. The common criteria process can seem overcomplicated, but in truth, every step is well defined. During the evaluation, everything happens because of a reason. The rules and requirements of how a laboratory performs its work are available and very well defined. The common evaluation methodology can be consulted, as well as the common criteria, to understand the motives behind the laboratory activities. The security, functional, and assurance requirements can be read and understood from the common criteria, but the evaluation activities can be followed much more easily from the common evaluation methodology, which contains a description about every activity in steps, called work units. If you receive an observation report, you can turn to these methodology. It is also important to understand how the whole system works. There are objectives behind the requirements and the security problem definition behind the objectives, meaning the threats, policies, and assumptions, which all refer to the assets, as it is the structure of the common criteria. It is put together in a logical way, and by understanding it precisely, the evaluation can be achieved in the previously planned way and time. There are also interpretations which can be found in the CCLab and SOGIS web pages, for example, about the composite evaluation approach behind smart card applet evaluations. If all these seem to be too complicated, it is still a good idea to look for someone who is familiar with the process, because one step at a time, they will be able to lead you to the end of the journey called Common Criteria Evaluation Process.
Thank you, Gabor. So this is Matt again. I agree with all the points that you just made, particularly your last one. I think it is a journey, and I think there's a lot to understand when making these decisions, building a detailed plan and working through the evaluation. I think there's a lot of resources that are required to produce different documentation and to follow through on the evaluation. That's why Corsec exists, is to try to provide that help and that assistance to go through this. Corsec is there to try to provide guidance on this journey, helping make decisions, guiding those decisions, building the plan on where you're going to go. And we're there to also take some of the burden off of the product vendors out there with some of the resources that are required. So things like developing documentation, addressing concerns, and also performing testing that the vendor is required to do. We want to put our 20 years of evaluation experience to work with you, and we want to take those 1,000+ evaluations that we've done, the lessons learned from them, and help guide you through to a successful validation, which you can achieve. Gabor?
Thank you, Matt. Yes, I'm one of the founders of CCLab. It is a pleasure to introduce ourselves. CCLab is a Hungarian common criteria laboratory working under the Italian scheme. We are accredited at 2 sites, Budapest and Debrecen. We have more than 10 licensed evaluators, with several successfully finished evaluations at the smart card, qualified signature creation device, and access control fields. We also have experts in secure development, and some of our evaluators are information management system auditors and GDPR experts as well. It is a pleasure to work for the whole globe as part of the Common Criteria Network. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, let's take our first question. The first one is, how long does it take to get through the process, and how long will my cert be valid? Matt?
Okay, yeah, this is a really common question, as you might imagine. How long does it take and how much does it cost? So let's address how long does it take. Okay, so it's going to depend on what you are measuring. So if you're measuring from the second you first start thinking about common criteria and how you might solve this and get your dev team started to work to address requirements, it could be a fairly lengthy process depending on the time to get the necessary changes into the product. What I generally tell people to do is to allow for about 12 to 14 months total time for a CC evaluation, just roughly. Now, it can be a lot shorter. There are some government schemes that do require that the evaluation process at the lab be done in less than 180 days. But usually what happens in those scenarios is there's a lot of work that can be done before the official evaluation starts within a laboratory. So know that it obviously can vary, but on the larger scale, you're probably looking at about 12 to 14 months total. Obviously, it can be less with a really organized development team and the right lab and consultant help there. Now, I guess the second piece of that question was, how long is a cert good for, which does really matter, right? Because we want to make sure that we've spent all this time and effort and energy on this. You know, what are you getting for it? Interestingly enough, that also depends. So different government schemes have different lengths of time that they're willing to endorse the validity of the certificate. Overall, most countries, a certificate is valuable for 5 years. So you can have 5 years of it staying up on the websites that are saying this is a valid product. There are a couple schemes that like to reduce that to slightly shorter times of about 2 years. The idea being that, well, a lot of products do change versions frequently and vulnerabilities frequently pop up. And so they want to see a product about every 2 years. Hopefully that answers the question.
All right, thank you. Next question. We have strict policies on access to source code. Do you need access to my code?
Oh, okay. Okay, so I can definitely do that. So on a code perspective, yes, I understand there being a concern about sharing source code. I guess I would start by saying the good news is there are a number of paths that you can pursue for common criteria that do not require access to source code. There are paths that you can follow that do require the laboratory to do a detailed review of all the source code and mapping each security function to the actual source code implementation and reviewing it. So in short, if you're going to do an EAL, an evaluation assurance level 3 evaluation or less, you should not have to provide the actual source code. Sometimes that's an easier way of proving things through source code review versus through some type of testing, but you're not required to. Evaluation assurance level 4 and above do require a detailed source code review for the security functions that are implemented and the ones that are claimed in that common criteria evaluation. I will say this though, with all of these scenarios, particularly when it involves source code, I think it's important that you spend some time vetting the companies you're going to be doing business with. So you need to keep in mind, yes, even if you happen to be in a scenario where you're not having to share your source code, you're still sharing an awful lot of intellectual property. So I did just want to mention, I think it's worth spending some time really asking IP protection types of questions with your consultant, your lab, and make sure you and your legal team understand what does get passed on to the government schemes as well.
All right, thank you, sir. The next question's coming in. Our development team is releasing a new version of our product every couple quarters. Will we need to certify each version?
Okay, let's see. That's a great question. I guess the best place to start with this is to say, let's just say that common criteria is a snapshot in time evaluation where you pick a specific version of a product that gets tested, and all the assurance and all the analysis is based on that one version that's been looked at in detail. Having said that, I understand, and the government entities even understand, that most product companies don't release a product version once every couple years. In fact, with agile development, a lot of times there's small delta releases and small product updates every couple months, or in some cases monthly. So there are ways of managing this. So the first thing I was going to say is I think there is some understanding among government purchasers that they can choose to stay on the validated product version, the one that got all the scrutiny, or they can talk to the vendor about what is the delta between what got validated and what is being sold now. And a lot of times it's patches and bug fixes and potentially importantly, security changes as well. And so I think that a lot of governments are prepared to make that risk-based analysis on choosing the specific validated version versus what is available now. Having said that, there are a number of government agencies that really care about making sure they're running the validated version. And so one of the good things about all of this is that you do have an option to pursue a quicker revalidation depending on the amount of changes that have been made. So if there is a government customer or any purchaser, I guess, that says, no, I really want to make sure that this Delta release small change version is actually the one validated, and they're willing to spend enough money with you, right, to justify this, there is a process where we can do assurance continuity in common criteria. And basically what that is it's where the laboratory and your government scheme is only going to be focused on what were the changes since the last big evaluation. And we can and pursue a process that's much quicker and much less expensive than the initial first evaluation.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Let's see. We probably have time for one or two more questions here. The next one, both speakers talked about product testing. What are they actually testing?
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't realize we didn't call this out. I did mention, I think, that common criteria is focused on security functionality, but let's be a little bit more clear. At the start of an evaluation, we're going to end up authoring a document called a security target. That security target document includes specific security functions that the product offers that will be tested by the vendor and then tested by the evaluation lab. So we need to show evidence of all of that testing. And it's those security functions similar to auditing requirements or specific things that need to be audited, how you're doing identification, authentication, how the cryptography is implemented, how role management and role escalation is prevented, a number of things like that can be claimed. Another piece I want to mention here is that there is two pieces of this testing, right? It's all on the same functions, but the vendor does have to produce a certain amount of test evidence showing that they've validated these functions, and then the lab goes through and either redoes and then augments that testing, or just augments the testing done by a product vendor. I would be remiss if I didn't just at least mention that that can be burdensome, and so Corsec does have some services that we can provide to write test cases specifically for common criteria testing and then execute them for you.
All right, let's see, we're pretty much right up on our time frame here, but let's take one more question. Let's see, which one of these is going to apply to most people? Which is better, an EAL or a CPP?
Oh, okay. I wish I had a lot more time to answer this one, but let me just say this. An evaluation assurance level evaluation is giving you a specific amount of confidence, or the purchaser sitting around of confidence in the things that were tested. And the EAL tells you how much assurance you should have. There's levels 1 through 7. And so what the person is really asking here is, should I pursue an evaluation that specifically calls out the evaluation assurance level? Or another path is there are these CPPs, collaborative protection profiles, that have been authored by a wide group of people involving multiple government entities, as well as product companies and industry and laboratories, consultants involved in writing these CPPs. And the CPPs don't always or don't include an assurance level specifically. They have a lot of assurances that must be met, but it's more tailored assurance for those functions. And so CPPs are not given a traditional EAL rating. And so all that background to say, what's better? Well, honestly, here's the thing, is it depends on which nation you're trying to sell to and which purchasers, what they're interested in. So you're getting assurance both ways, but I did want to call out that if you are, when you're kind of choosing whether to use one of these CPPs or not, you do have to decide where you're heading. And so I think it's important to start with a good plan at the beginning so you know where you're trying to get to. The reason I bring that up specifically is there are choices here that could preclude you from pursuing sales into a specific government entity. A good example of that might be that if you are ultimately trying to sell into the US DoD and you want to be listed on their DoD APL list, you really want to make sure that you've conformed to a CPP instead of just pursuing a normal EAL evaluation, because there are requirements that come in later on when you're trying to achieve that product listing for the DoD. So it really comes down to, is one better or not? No, it really depends on who you're trying to sell to and which groups, right? So there could be lots of different entities you're trying to sell to, and we need to make the best case for hitting most of those entities. I will also just mention that, just real quickly, there is a scenario where you could pursue both at not double the cost, and so that's something you could look at as well.
Thank you, Matt. And that's about all the time we have for today. If you do have additional questions, please remember you can always submit them directly to one of the speakers' information on the screen. They'll get back to you. Additionally, we want to thank the participants as well as our speakers. And if you do need additional information, please feel free to visit the websites, cclab.hu as well as corsec.com. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.